Halo, selamat siang.
Selamat siang Pak Muhadi.
Sorry, aku tak set kamera dulu.
Oh ya, Pak.
Hai, siap. Kurang tinggi.
Selamat siang Bapak.
Apa tuh suaranya? Ini lebih bagus ya. Aku tidak bisa mendengar suara apapun.
Kami belum ngomong, Pak. Tapi sudah kedengaran Bapak, suara Pak Muhadi sudah
Ya,
terdengar.
suara Bapak masuk Pak.
Halo? Intan bisa dengar?
Bisa Pak?
Saya kok tidak bisa mendengar suara apapun ya? Coba aku list dulu.
Pak Muhadi, Bapak bisa dengar suara kita, Pak? Ayo. Pak Muhadi, sudah bisa dengar suara kami, Pak?
Sudah Intan.
Ya. Oke, sip.
Tim, are you there? Mas Doni? sudah ada juga ya.
Hi, Mahadi.
Hello team,
Siang,
how are
Mahadi.
you?
Good. How are you all?
I'm fine. Selamat siang Mas Doni. What time is it now in Melbourne team?
4 p.m.
Oh, 4 p.m. Okay. 3 hours. We will start in around 2 minutes. Okay? Okay, we are ready in 1 minute. Intan, sudah siap?
Silakan Pak, sudah bisa dimulai saja Pak.
Baik, selamat siang, selamat datang di webinar dalam rangkaian peringatan 75 tahun pengeboman Hiroshima dan Nagasaki. Pada hari ini kita akan kedatangan 2 tamu penting yang luar biasa, yang mewakili organisasi-organisasi yang luar biasa aktif dalam upaya untuk menghapuskan senjata nuklir, yakni dari ICRC, International Committee of the Red Cross, dan dari ICAN, International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. Selamat datang Mas Christian Doni Putranto dari ICRC. And welcome to you, team from ICAN, International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. Ya, 75 tahun, waktu yang cukup panjang tentunya ya. 75 tahun yang lalu, umat manusia mengalami sebuah tragedi yang luar biasa yang diakibatkan oleh ledakan bom atom di 2 kota di Jepang, di Nagasaki dan Hiroshima. Dampak dari ledakan bom atom itu jelas sangat luar biasa, merupakan tragedi kemanusiaan yang tidak bisa terbayangkan. Mas Doni nanti mungkin akan bisa bercerita banyak bagaimana perwakilan ICRC yang datang di sana, yang menyaksikan secara langsung beberapa minggu ya setelah dijatuhkannya bom atom itu, menggambarkan betapa luar biasanya kerusakan, kehancuran, dan penderitaan umat manusia yang diakibatkan. Nah, berangkat dari situ, kemudian pada tahun 1946, Perserikatan Bangsa-Bangsa berketetapan untuk menghapuskan senjata nuklir. Jadi sekarang hampir 75 tahun sejak PBB mengeluarkan resolusi yang pertama yang terkait dengan perusahaan senjata itu, ternyata tidak ada kemajuan yang sangat signifikan ke arah penghapusan senjata nuklir. Jadi selama hampir 75 tahun atau 75 tahun setelah bom atom dijatuhkan di Nagasaki dan Hiroshima, kita masih hidup dalam bayang-bayang senjata nuklir. Senjata nuklir bisa diledakkan dengan kesengajaan karena memang terjadi konflik atau peperangan, tetapi senjata nuklir bisa juga diledakkan karena ketidaksengajaan atau faktor kelalaian, faktor kesalahan teknis dan sebagainya. Tetapi dampaknya selalu sama, yakni tragedi kemanusiaan yang luar biasa. Nah, 2 organisasi yang mewakili yang kita undang perwakilannya di sini adalah dua organisasi yang sangat aktif di dalam memperjuangkan terwujudnya dunia bebas dari senjata nuklir. ICRC adalah saksi mata kehancuran di Hiroshima dan Nagasaki. ICRC adalah pemenang Nobel 3 kali, luar biasa, 1917, 1943 dan 44 dan 1963. Ya. Kemudian juga ICAN sangat aktif, terutama dalam beberapa tahun terakhir ini dan juga memperoleh hadiah Nobel. Jadi kita kedatangan dua organisasi, perwakilan dari dua organisasi yang mewakili pemenang Nobel perdamaian untuk bidang-bidang yang berkaitan dengan kemanusiaan. Perbincangan kita kali ini akan berkisar pada apa yang terjadi pada 75 tahun yang lalu ketika bom atom itu dijatuhkan di Hiroshima dan Nagasaki. Dan kemudian kita juga akan berbicara mengenai apa saja yang sudah dilakukan dan apa saja yang sudah dicapai sejauh ini. Dan kemudian juga tentunya kita akan berbicara tentang perkembangan terbaru dengan diadopsinya perjanjian pelarangan senjata nuklir, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons pada tahun 2017, yang sudah ditandatangani oleh lebih dari 80 negara, tetapi masih belum mencapai kuota 50 negara yang meratifikasinya. Nah, apa yang kita bisa harapkan dari sana? Kemudian juga apa yang kita bisa lakukan di Indonesia dan apa peran Indonesia di dalam upaya ke arah sana? Nah, saat ini sudah ada 44 negara yang meratifikasi. Berarti 6 negara lagi yang meratifikasi, maka Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons itu sudah akan bisa berlaku dan memiliki kekuatan hukum untuk mengawali sebuah proses menuju dunia bebas dari senjata nuklir. Nah, kita akan memperoleh pemaparan dari Mas Doni dan juga dari tim WISE yang masing-masing memiliki juga concern terhadap keberadaan senjata nuklir di dunia ini. Tim, good afternoon and welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. I just welcome the participants and I just explained what we are doing today. We are going to talk about what happened 75 years ago in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then also within the time frame of 75 years, what we have achieved in order to get into what our goals to see the world without nuclear weapons. And we would like also to discuss about what is the meaning of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and the role of the state and the nations, including Indonesia, to play in order to support the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and at the end to achieve a world without nuclear weapons. So we would like to hear from you, Tim, as a representative of ICAN, Nobel Prize winner in 2017, as well as from Christian Doni Putranto from the ICRC in Jakarta, which is also a Nobel Prize winner 3 times, in fact. So we are very lucky to have the representative of the Nobel Prize winners. We can start with Tim or Pasdoni.
You decide, Mahadi.
Yes.
Okay, let's start with Doni because he's representing ICRC. The representative of ICRC was in Hiroshima at the time. We can start with the situation where the Hiroshima after the bombing. Mas Doni, maybe 20 minutes. Okay. Before you start, I would like to inform the participants this program is bilingual. You can raise the question, give your response in Indonesian or in English. Otherwise, Tim will respond it in English because Tim has to learn Indonesian actually. And Mas Doni also can also respond it in Indonesian or in English, depending on the question. Okay, silakan Mas Doni. Time is yours.
Baik, terima kasih Pak Muhadi. Nice to meet you, Tim. Greetings from Jakarta. And selamat siang kepada rekan-rekan peserta semuanya. Terima kasih kepada IIS UGM yang telah bekerja sama dengan ICRC untuk mengadakan webinar ini, termasuk melakukan campaign promosi Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons yang telah kita lakukan setidaknya 2-3 minggu terakhir. Jadi untuk memulai, saya akan mencoba share screen saya sebentar. Oke, terlihat Pak Muhadi ya? Oke, baik. Sesuai dengan pembicaraan dengan panitia, memang apa yang akan kami sampaikan dari ICRC lebih fokus kepada humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons and also bagaimana pengaturan ataupun bagaimana hukum humaniter internasional atau hukum perang melihat senjata nuklir. Bagaimana, apakah dilarang, apakah tidak, apabila dilarang sejauh mana, dan lain sebagainya. Nah, untuk hal ini, pertama tentu sesuai dengan yang disampaikan oleh Pak Muhadi, kita harus kembali ke 75 tahun yang lalu, kurang lebihnya. Apabila kita ingin melihat humanitarian consequences dari senjata nuklir. Ini saya tampilkan the telegram that was sent by an ICRC delegate named Fritz Billfinger. Dia saat itu bertugas di delegasi ICRC di Tokyo, dan dia diutus pergi ke Hiroshima pada akhir Agustus, dan ini telegram yang ia kirimkan dari Hiroshima ke kantor ICRC di Tokyo. Bisa dipersingkat, pada intinya adalah kotak yang di sebelah kiri ini saya tuliskan kembali agar lebih jelas bagi rekan-rekan sekalian yang melihatnya, bahwa city wiped out di Hiroshima. 80% seluruh fasilitas ataupun rumah sakit hancur atau rusak parah. Dia secara langsung melihat atau mengecek 2 rumah sakit darurat yang kondisinya tidak lagi dapat digambarkan. Lalu yang paling menarik buat saya dari telegram yang dikirimkan oleh Billfinger di sini adalah the effect of the bomb was mysteriously serious. Tahun 45 tidak tahu bom nuklir seperti apa, dia menganggap ini sangat serius. Tetapi seriusnya seperti apa dia juga nggak bisa menggambarkan. Ini yang menjadi elemen yang menurut saya paling menarik dan paling luar biasa dari apa yang digambarkan oleh Billfinger saat itu. Lalu kalau kita juga merunut kepada kalimat-kalimat terakhir beliau di telegram, kurang lebih perkiraan beliau adalah lebih dari 100.000 orang seketika terluka yang berada di rumah sakit darurat. 100.000 orang seketika. Jadi dalam hitungan sekian minggu, in a matter of couple of weeks, 100.000 orang terluka dan sulit dirawat karena kalau bisa dilihat tentu dampak yang luar biasa kepada seluruh infrastruktur yang ada di kota tersebut. Dan hal ini pun kemudian digambarkan lebih lanjut di dalam laporan yang ditulis oleh Fritz Billfinger juga 2 bulan kemudian. Laporannya bersifat lebih lengkap apa yang ia lihat, dan dia juga melakukan 1 atau 2 wawancara dengan korban di rumah sakit, apa yang mereka lihat, saksikan saat ketika bom tersebut dijatuhkan di Hiroshima dan Nagasaki. Dan laporannya kurang lebih seperti ini yang ia tuliskan. Saya hanya mengambil bagian penutupnya atau bagian conclusion-nya saja, karena cukup panjang, yang pada intinya dia menyatakan bahwa bom yang ia lihat dampaknya di Hiroshima khususnya, itu sangat berbeda dampaknya dibandingkan bahkan senjata atau bom gas yang dia telah mungkin digunakan seperti di Perang Dunia Pertama misalkan. Jadi dampaknya sangat berbeda, jauh lebih parah dibandingkan senjata-senjata yang sudah ada saat itu. Dan mungkin sampai sekarang kita masih melihat elemen ataupun unsur yang sama sebagaimana digambarkan 75 tahun yang lalu. Yang juga menarik dari sini adalah Billfinger menyatakan bahwa Hiroshima seketika diledakkan ataupun blasted in an instant manner. Jadi dalam ketika. Jadi dalam hitungan detik saja, bukan lagi hitungan jam ataupun waktu yang lebih lama. Ini juga karakteristik yang saya pikir merupakan gambaran konsekuensi kemanusiaan yang luar biasa tetapi ke arah negatif dan tidak begitu dapat kita tanggung akibatnya. Ini 75 tahun yang lalu. Lalu 5 tahun kemudian setelah bom Hiroshima Nagasaki dijatuhkan, ICRC melihat perkembangan saat itu dan juga saat itu dalam momentum setelah adopsi Konvensi Jenewa tahun 49. Setahun sesudahnya ICRC melakukan semacam appeal kurang lebih kepada negara-negara pihak Konvensi Jenewa 49 saat itu. Yang saya tuliskan di sini pada intinya, namun yang paling menarik 70 tahun yang lalu ICRC sudah langsung mengeluarkan pernyataan terbuka bahwa all steps to reach an agreement on the prohibition of nuclear weapons or atomic weapons itu sudah dilakukan 70 tahun yang lalu. Ketika saat itu mungkin kita masih belum bisa grasping the whole idea on what nuclear weapons were at the time, tetapi sudah melihat akibat di dua kota Nagasaki, Hiroshima, sudah dapat disimpulkan ini senjata yang tidak boleh ada di muka bumi. Jadi harus dilarang dan membutuhkan kesepakatan internasional yang dihormati oleh negara-negara. Yang menjadi penekanan di sini tentu adalah apa yang dituliskan di situ, hukum baik yang tertulis maupun tidak tertulis tidak akan memiliki kekuatan dihadapkan dengan dampak yang ditimbulkan dari senjata nuklir atau senjata bom atom tersebut. Ini yang dikatakan 70 tahun yang lalu. Seiring berjalannya waktu tentu nanti kita melihat perkembangan bagaimana hukum humaniter secara khusus menyesuaikan dengan senjata nuklir. Termasuk secara hukum internasional secara umum memang juga sebenarnya sudah banyak semacam pelarangan, tetapi tidak ada yang seperti Pak Muhadi pernah sampaikan minggu lalu ketika ada virtual exhibition of the atomic bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, yang ada hanya partial prohibitions, tidak pernah ada complete or total prohibition. Entah itu yang dilarang, misalkan di kolom pertama, yang dilarang hanya proliferasinya saja atau pengembangannya saja yang dilarang, atau tesnya saja yang dilarang. Lalu di kolom kedua, larangan hanya fokus kepada pembentukannya, produksinya, ataupun pembeliannya, penerimaannya di wilayah tertentu. Jadi bukan di satu dunia, misalkan di Southeast Asia, or in Africa, or in Latin America. There has never been a global complete prohibition on nuclear weapons at the moment from an international law perspective. Lalu ketiga, di kolom yang ketiga juga prohibition ataupun larangan untuk meletakkan senjata nuklir atau senjata pemusnah massal lainnya di laut, di dasar laut. Lalu terakhir tentu larangan-larangan yang masih bersifat terbatas yang tidak pernah menyentuh larangan secara menyeluruh apa yang nanti mudah-mudahan dalam waktu dekat dapat di-enforce ketika Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons sudah berlaku, di mana treaty tersebut memang secara menyeluruh melarang senjata nuklir baik itu dari persiapan sampai pun penggunaannya. Lalu berikutnya, bagaimana hukum humaniter secara spesifik kemudian melihat hal ini? Sebagai pengantar sekilas, hukum humaniter merupakan sekelompok peraturan yang atas tujuan kemanusiaan memang bertujuan untuk membatasi dampak dari peperangan. Ini dasarnya, definisi sangat sederhana, prinsipnya apa saja, saya tuliskan, prinsip kemanusiaan, prinsip pembedaan, proporsionalitas, prinsip kehati-hatian, jadi ketika mereka yang berperang harus hati-hati ketika menggunakan ataupun melakukan operasi militer, lalu larangan untuk menimbulkan luka yang berlebihan atau yang tidak perlu. Lalu terakhir, larangan untuk menyerang secara membabi buta, jadi dia tidak melihat mana yang militer, mana yang sasaran yang sah, dan lain sebagainya. Instrumen hukum yang utama yang saya tampilkan contohnya adalah Hague Regulations dari tahun 1907, Geneva Conventions 1949, lalu Protokol Tambahan 77, serta yang lain. Bagaimana hukum humaniter kemudian melihat senjata nuklir? Apakah ada pelarangan secara spesifik? Tidak ada, tetapi sifat dari senjata nuklir The nature of nuclear weapons membuat senjata nuklir sangat tidak mungkin apabila digunakan untuk akan sejalan ataupun tetap berada di dalam koridor prinsip-prinsip dan aturan-aturan hukum humaniter, termasuk ke dalam hukum atau kerangka hukum yang lain, hukum HAM, hukum lingkungan, dan lain sebagainya. Misalkan penggunaan senjata nuklir tidak akan pernah, saya ulangi, penggunaan senjata nuklir tidak akan pernah bisa sejalan dengan misalkan prinsip pembedaan. Pembedaan adalah membedakan mana yang sasaran militer, mana yang sipil. Bagaimana bisa membedakan kalau dampaknya saja dari senjata nuklir itu bisa kilometer radiusnya yang tidak mungkin bisa membedakan. Lalu proporsionalitas juga. Apakah keuntungan militer yang ingin didapat proporsional dengan dampak kemanusiaan yang mungkin ditimbulkan? Kalau kita berkaca dari Hiroshima Nagasaki, tidak bisa juga. Korban saat itu di Hiroshima Nagasaki ratusan ribu dalam sekejap. Tetapi keuntungan militernya seperti apa? Perlu dilihat lagi. Lalu menimbulkan luka yang berlebihan atau tidak perlu. Ini juga 75 tahun setelah Hiroshima Nagasaki sampai sekarang kita melihat minggu lalu contohnya Hibakusha masih mengalami penderitaan baik itu fisik maupun psikologis. Itu juga termasuk yang tidak mungkin bisa direkonsiliasi dengan peraturan prinsip dasar hukum humaniter. Dan sebenarnya hal ini pun juga menjadi perhatian ketika sebuah pertanyaan muncul dari Majelis Umum PBB, dari General Assembly PBB, ini saya lewatkan dulu. Ketika tahun 95-96, Mahkamah Internasional diberikan pertanyaan oleh Majelis Umum PBB tentang legalitas dari senjata nuklir. Jadi pada intinya mereka bertanya whether or not nuclear weapons in case of being used or used for a threat akan menjadi ilegal berdasarkan hukum internasional. Ini yang dikatakan oleh mahkamah saat itu, bahwa dalam hal penggunaannya senjata nuklir would in all circumstances be unable untuk membedakan mana yang kombatan atau sasaran militer, mana yang populasi sipil. Karena dampaknya pada umumnya tidak bisa dikontrol atau dibatasi. Misalkan hanya kecamatan A saja atau kota A saja tidak bisa. Karena secara sifat dia memang seperti itu. Lalu terakhir, the use of nuclear weapons should therefore be prohibited in any circumstances, notwithstanding the absence of any explicit conventional prohibition. Jadi meskipun tidak ada larangan yang spesifik, mahkamah saat itu berpandangan bahwa hal ini bukan berarti senjata nuklir secara ipso facto, secara otomatis akan dapat digunakan kapanpun. Jadi dia tetap harus mematuhi kerangka koridor hukum yang berlaku, khususnya hukum humaniter. Dan dalam hal ini pun maka saya ingin mengutip klausula Martens, yang pada intinya klausula ini sudah sangat tua tetapi masih relevan sampai sekarang. Pertama kali dikatakan oleh seorang perwira militer namanya Martens dari Rusia pada kurang lebih 100 tahun yang lalu, yang mengatakan bahwa apabila di masa depan belum ada ketentuan peraturan yang spesifik melarang sebuah tindakan dalam peperangan, maka hal tersebut diatur berdasarkan the laws of humanity and the requirements of the public conscience. Ini saya rasa juga sangat relevan bagi senjata nuklir. Apakah senjata nuklir bisa sejalan dengan rasa kemanusiaan dan juga dari pendapat umum publik? Saya rasa tidak. Dan mahkamah pun ketika kurang lebih 24 tahun yang lalu melakukan penilaian terhadap sifat dan dampak dari senjata nuklir sudah sangat jelas disampaikan di sini. Karakter senjata nuklir membuat senjata nuklir potentially catastrophic karena tidak dapat dibatasi baik itu oleh waktu ataupun oleh tempat. Lalu radiasi yang dilepaskan juga akan mempengaruhi kesehatan, agrikultur, demografis yang sangat luas yang tidak dapat dibatasi. Yang terakhir yang saya rasa sangat penting, dampaknya pun juga akan mempengaruhi generasi masa mendatang, bukan saja generasi yang saat ini, juga yang masa mendatang. Ini saya pikir juga menjadi kekuatan utama melihat bukan saja dari segi legal maupun segi moral terhadap legalitas senjata nuklir. Dan saya pun terpikir jadi membuat semacam endless cycle of suffering yang saya tampilkan di layar, di mana ketika sebuah senjata nuklir dijatuhkan, maka akan menimbulkan pertama di kotak paling atas, the lack of capacity, baik oleh negara tersebut, di mana wilayah tersebut dijatuhkan senjata nuklir, ataupun masyarakat internasional, untuk coping ataupun menghadapi dampak dari detonasi nuklir. Lalu hal ini pun beranjak kepada jumlah nyawa yang akan hilang, jumlah manusia yang terdampak, lalu medical needs atau kebutuhan medis yang sangat tinggi pasti, di mana saat ini akan sangat sulit dipenuhi karena fasilitas medis akan banyak yang hancur, sebagaimana tadi diilustrasikan oleh Bill Finger 75 tahun yang lalu. Lalu akses ke wilayah tersebut apabila ada bantuan dari luar akan datang, akan sangat sulit juga untuk dipenuhi karena akan banyak halangan-halangan untuk masuk, sehingga kembali menghambat proses bantuan kemanusiaan serta kesehatan. Lalu termasuk bagi para personel kemanusiaan yang akan membantu. Health risk-nya, resiko kesehatan mereka terekspos oleh radiasi. Terakhir tentu dampak lingkungan. Ini merupakan lingkaran yang tidak akan berhenti. Kalau bisa bilang ini sebagai lingkaran setan lah ya kurang lebih. Karena dia menimbulkan hal negatif yang menimbulkan efek domino yang tidak akan ada habisnya. Secara sekilas ini juga bisa menimbulkan bagi rekan-rekan sebuah gambaran umum apa yang terjadi 75 tahun yang lalu ketika untuk pertama kalinya dan sampai sekarang puji Tuhan terakhir kalinya senjata nuklir digunakan. Di Hiroshima dan Nagasaki, 40% di Hiroshima populasinya terbunuh dari peledakan bom tersebut. Wilayah yang terdampak 11 km, jadi bisa dibayangkan luasnya. Lalu 140.000 orang meninggal atau kehilangan nyawa dari bombing di Hiroshima. Lalu di Nagasaki juga 60% populasi menjadi korban, 74.000 meninggal secara instan, 75.000 terluka. Ini saya rasa juga melihat bagaimana dampak kemanusiaan dari senjata nuklir sangatlah luas, lalu sangatlah tidak melihat mana yang sasaran militer, mana yang bukan, dan hal ini pun menjadi sebuah tantangan, bukan saja tantangan hukum, namun juga tantangan moral bagi kemanusiaan saat ini. Terakhir, sebelum mencapai penutupan, saya rasa sangatlah relevan apabila kami menampilkan sampaikan bersama oleh ICRC dan oleh IFRC kurang lebih 3 tahun lalu, yang pada intinya mengulang statement dari Gerakan Internasional Palang Merah dan Bulan Sabit Merah yang disampaikan di Nagasaki saat itu. Bahwa pada intinya apabila kita mengambil perspektif keamanan saja, tentu ini bukanlah sebuah perspektif yang dapat dipertahankan. Karena bagaimana kita bisa memberikan jaminan keamanan, tapi justru di sisi yang lain mengancam kemanusiaan yang menjadi titik dasar kita ingin mengamankan manusia. Menjadi sebuah analogi yang tidak begitu akurat pada intinya. Jadi sudah waktunya memang untuk mengedepankan kemanusiaan dengan melarang serta secara menyeluruh menghilangkan senjata nuklir dari muka dunia. Demikian Pak Muhadi, kurang lebih apa yang dapat kami bisa share pengalaman dari organisasi kami dan bagaimana hukum humaniter melihat senjata nuklir sampai dewasa ini. Saya kembalikan kepada Pak Muhadi. Terima kasih, Pak. Pak Muhadi belum di-unmute.
Terima kasih, Mas Doni. Saya kira dari pemaparan yang disampaikan Mas Doni tadi terlihat dengan sangat jelas bahwa ICRC secara konsisten sangat mendukung perlucutan senjata nuklir karena dalam kondisi apapun ledakan senjata nuklir itu tidak akan pernah bisa memenuhi kriteria kemanusiaan yang ingin diusung melalui international humanitarian law. Saya kira Ini sebuah poin yang sangat penting yang bisa kita lihat di sini. Oke, kita akan melanjutkan langsung dengan pemaparan dari tim. Tim, you see the presentation from ICRC. It has been very consistent from the very beginning that ICRC supported the elimination of nuclear weapons. And ICANN has also been working on that issue, more specifically on the nuclear weapons. And for that matter, in 2017, ICANN received Nobel Prize for its dedication and for the tireless effort to bring the adoption of the treaty or the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Okay, I will pass on you, Tim, to explain what's going on from the perspective of ICANN. Time yours.
Thank you so much, Mahadi, and thank you also to your colleagues at the Institute of International Studies for kindly inviting me to participate in this event, and thank you to Mr. Putranto from the ICRC for his remarks and for reminding us of the important work that the ICRC has done in this area, not just in recent years, but indeed since the very beginning of the atomic age with the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it's so important that we do come together to commemorate those horrific attacks, which claimed more than 250,000 lives and caused suffering across generations. And in commemorating the attacks, we're not only remembering the horrors of the past, we're also, in a sense, rededicating ourselves to the cause of disarmament and ensuring that no other city anywhere in the world ever suffers the same fate as Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And there are an estimated 13,000 nuclear weapons in the world today. So there is a very real risk that one day these weapons will be used again with catastrophic effects unless we act very expeditiously to eliminate them from the world. So thank you for the important work that the IIS and ICRC are doing in this area. I want to focus today on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, how this treaty came about, how it differs from other treaties that relate to nuclear weapons, and how this treaty is likely to have an impact over the long term. I want to also talk briefly at the conclusion of my remarks about the important role that Indonesia played in bringing this treaty about and why Indonesia's ratification is so crucial. This treaty came about as a result of a deliberate effort by the ICRC, by ICANN, and by governments that support disarmament to reframe the whole debate about nuclear weapons. And the reframing of the debate was about placing the focus on the humanitarian impacts of the weapons when they're used or when they're tested. And this was about taking the discussion away from very abstract concepts such as deterrence and strategic stability, which are concepts that have dominated a lot of the international discourse on nuclear weapons, and really showing that these weapons are weapons of war that are unacceptable on humanitarian grounds and should be prohibited and eliminated, just like other weapons that have unacceptable humanitarian consequences. And we shouldn't treat nuclear weapons simply as instruments of power. And so what we did in 2013 and 2014 was work together with governments to look in detail at what these weapons do when used. And there were 3 major intergovernmental conferences held in Norway, in Mexico, and in Austria that brought together more than 150 of the world's countries. And the conclusion from those conferences was very clear that every effort needed to be made by the international community to stigmatise, prohibit, and eliminate these weapons. And at those conferences, we heard from survivors of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We also heard from survivors of nuclear testing around the world. And listening to their testimony was very compelling, and I think served as a wake-up call to many of the governments that were represented at these conferences. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki talked about the horrific scenes that they witnessed on 6th and 9th August 1945. They talked about losing multiple family members, losing multiple classmates, about the suffering that they endured in the immediate aftermath, as well as the decades of suffering with higher rates of cancer and other illnesses as a result of their exposure to radiation. We also had presentations from the Red Cross and others about the lack of any humanitarian response capacity to a nuclear attack. And these organisations stated very categorically that they would be utterly powerless to respond in a meaningful sense if a nuclear weapon were used again today. And this is firstly because of the scale of the devastation that would come about as a result of a nuclear attack, but also because of the radiological impacts. It would be very dangerous for first responders to enter into the area of the bombing. We also heard presentations from various UN agencies about the profound impact that a nuclear attack would have on their area of work. So they discussed the impact on migration, with potentially millions of people fleeing a country where nuclear weapons had been used. They also spoke about the impact that it could have on the global climate, especially if multiple nuclear weapons were used against cities. They spoke about the impact that it would have on agricultural production around the world, how a nuclear attack could potentially lead to famine, widespread famine. And these are all of the effects that could be observed in addition to the very immediate devastation of people in the vicinity of the bombing dying. And so faced with this evidence, it became very clear to governments that they needed to act, and that this is not simply an issue that should be dealt with by the nuclear-armed nations. There are just 9 countries with nuclear weapons. The vast majority of the world's nations don't possess these weapons, and yet every nation's security is undermined by the existence of these weapons in the world. And therefore, every nation has the right and the responsibility to work to eliminate these weapons. And what we did was look at the approach that has been taken with respect to other unacceptable weapons. And that approach has been to put in place a clear and comprehensive prohibition. And through that prohibition, progress can be made towards eliminating the weapons. And the majority of the world's governments concluded that this is the approach that needs to be taken with respect to nuclear weapons. And as Mr. Petranto pointed out in his presentation, until the adoption of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in 2017, there was no comprehensive treaty-based prohibition on nuclear weapons. What we have are the Non-Proliferation Treaty, being essentially a prohibition on the proliferation of nuclear weapons. There's a comprehensive ban on nuclear testing, although that hasn't yet entered into force. And there are various regional prohibitions on nuclear weapons. But the Nuclear Weapon Ban Treaty of 2017 is the first comprehensive global prohibition on nuclear weapons. And so the approach taken in this treaty is an abolitionist approach, and it differs from a non-proliferation approach. So it's not just about stopping the spread of the weapons, it's about getting rid of all of the weapons that already exist. It's also different from an arms control approach. You would be familiar with the agreements between the United States and Russia to limit the number of nuclear weapons that they have in deployment. What the Nuclear Weapon Ban Treaty does is say there's in fact no acceptable number of nuclear weapons. There are no circumstances in which the use of these weapons could be justified, and it establishes a kind of a zero tolerance approach to nuclear weapons, as distinct from an arms control approach, which is simply about placing limitations on the weapons. And I think that Indonesia said it very well during the negotiations of the treaty. It's saying that we have a humanitarian imperative to act, and that this treaty is about rendering the doctrine of deterrence obsolete. And this idea of deterrence is that nuclear weapons have somehow kept the peace around the world by stopping other countries from using them because one country possesses them and is so fearful of the impacts that the weapons will have. And this treaty challenges that notion that possessing a nuclear weapon for deterrence purposes is acceptable. One of the problems with the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is the treaty that was negotiated in 1968, is that the 5 countries under that treaty which have nuclear weapons, being the US, Russia, France, China, and the United Kingdom, have interpreted it as a license to retain their weapons indefinitely. They refer to themselves as the responsible nuclear weapon states. And even though the Non-Proliferation Treaty says they must pursue negotiations for disarmament, they're in fact investing very heavily in the modernisation of their nuclear arsenals and have plans to retain their nuclear weapons for many decades to come. So they haven't taken that obligation seriously, and instead they consider themselves as being entitled to possess nuclear weapons. And this new treaty, the Ban Treaty adopted in 2017, really tries to change that understanding that some countries can have these weapons and others can't. And it says very clearly that no country can legitimately have these weapons given the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of their use. I think that some countries with these weapons really, the primary reason that they have the weapons is that they view them as a kind of status symbol. They believe that it gives them power and prestige in international affairs. And so we need to really challenge that notion, and the idea of stigmatizing nuclear weapons and creating a taboo and a strong global norm against nuclear weapons is very much about changing that kind of narrative and challenging that perception of nuclear weapons as something that are good and desirable. So this treaty was adopted with the support of 122 countries, including Indonesia, and it opened for signature a few months after being adopted. Indonesia was one of the first countries to sign it. It currently has 82 signatures. But the important thing for bringing the treaty into force and for making the treaty impactful is to have countries ratify it. Currently, there are 44 countries that have ratified it, and there need to be 50 countries in order to bring the treaty into force. So we're working very hard to try to secure those remaining 6 ratifications needed for entry into force. And I certainly hope that Indonesia will act very quickly so that it can be one of these original 50 states parties to the treaty. So the treaty in Article 1 sets out the prohibitions. So it says very clearly that, of course, the use of nuclear weapons is prohibited, testing of nuclear weapons, development, production of nuclear weapons, and the possession of nuclear weapons. It also says that a country cannot host another country's nuclear weapons on its territory. This is currently a problem in a number of European countries. And the Article 1 also says that a country cannot assist or encourage another country to engage in any of the prohibited activities. So it's about trying to influence the behaviour of the nuclear armed states by preventing their allies around the world from assisting them in any way. Article 4 says that a country with nuclear weapons has 2 options. It can either get rid of its nuclear weapons and then join the treaty, in which case, under the treaty, it must be able to demonstrate that it has eliminated its nuclear weapons. And so an independent body would be nominated to verify that. The other option is for a nuclear armed state to join the treaty with nuclear weapons, in which case it would be required to immediately remove those weapons from operational readiness and then work to eliminate them within a defined period. And that process would be overseen by an international body to be nominated by the parties to the treaty. Another important aspect of the treaty is the provision on victim assistance and environmental remediation. So anywhere that these weapons have been used or tested around the world, efforts should be made to ensure that the victims are given adequate assistance and that steps are taken to remediate the contaminated environments. Just to conclude with a few observations about Indonesia. As I mentioned, Indonesia played a very important role, not only in the negotiation of this treaty, but also in the process leading up to the negotiations. And when I say Indonesia, I'm referring not only to the Indonesian government, but also to Indonesian civil society, especially with the Institute of International Studies. There was an important meeting that IIS held, I think in 2013, that helped to build regional support for the idea of this treaty. That was in Yogyakarta. And at every step of the way, Indonesia has been very supportive. Of course, Indonesia plays a very prominent role in the non-aligned movement. It has been a long-standing position of the Indonesian government to support efforts for nuclear disarmament. And so joining this treaty is a very natural and consistent thing for the Indonesian government to do, to show principled leadership on an issue of importance to the future of humanity. I think that Indonesia can speak with great moral authority on this issue as a country which has stated very clearly that these weapons are abhorrent and do not enhance security. Quite the contrary, that these are weapons that undermine security. And I think there's a real potential for Indonesia to continue playing that leadership role in the future. So we look forward very much to celebrating Indonesia's ratification, hopefully sooner rather than later. And I'll leave it there. Thanks, Mahadi.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim. Baik, saya kira kita sudah mendengarkan pemaparan dari Mas Doni Putranto dan tim Wright. Terlihat di situ satu benang merah yang cukup jelas. Bagaimana isu kemanusiaan kemudian menjadi faktor penting yang mengubah cara pandang kita terhadap senjata nuklir. Jadi apa yang selama ini digaungkan oleh ICRC bahwa senjata nuklir itu tidak mungkin bisa digunakan tanpa melanggar international humanitarian law. Dan ICRC sudah sejak awal menunjukkan bagaimana senjata nuklir itu menghasilkan tragedi kemanusiaan yang luar biasa. Nah, tetapi untuk jangka waktu yang lama, gagasan tentang tragedi kemanusiaan yang dihasilkan oleh senjata nuklir ini tidak berubah menjadi sebuah kekuatan politik. Pada tahun 2013, ICAN dengan semua organisasi yang ada di dalamnya berusaha menjadikan isu kemanusiaan ini menjadi isu sentral di dalam memaknai senjata nuklir. Senjata nuklir menurut informasi yang disampaikan oleh Tim tadi, di dalam kerangka ini tidak lagi dilihat sebagai senjata yang memberikan keamanan, dan tadi sudah disebutkan juga oleh Mas Doni, tetapi justru sebaliknya, ini adalah ancaman kemanusiaan, ancaman eksistensial bagi umat manusia secara keseluruhan. Dan oleh karena itu, wacana tentang dampak kemanusiaan senjata nuklir ini menjadi isu sentral yang kemudian membawa kita pada sebuah kesepakatan internasional di PBB untuk mengadopsi perjanjian pelarangan senjata nuklir. Sekarang tinggal apakah atau bagaimana negara-negara yang punya komitmen untuk perlucutan senjata nuklir ini kemudian menopang perjanjian ini. Dan Indonesia termasuk salah satu negara yang sangat aktif di dalam negosiasi-negosiasi untuk perlucutan senjata nuklir, kemudian juga menjadi salah satu negara yang pertama menandatangani Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, tetapi kita masih belum meratifikasinya. Sementara itu kita membutuhkan 50 ratifikasi untuk menjadikan Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons ini bisa berlaku sebagai hukum internasional. Oke, kita akan lihat beberapa pertanyaan yang ada di sini. Kita mulai dengan Lazarus. dia membuat sebuah pernyataan. Saya kira kalau Lazarus punya koneksi yang cukup bagus, apakah bisa kita undang untuk menyampaikan pertanyaannya secara langsung? I asked Lazarus to raise the question directly because he has written so much word in the chat room. Juga Siska Pratiwi dan Adrita Arifin. Saya kira 3 penanya nanti kita berikan kesempatan untuk mengungkapkannya secara langsung, secara audio. Lazarus ada di sini? Oke, kalau tidak ada, saya akan coba bantu menyampaikan pertanyaan disampaikan oleh Lazarus. Lazarus menyampaikan pertanyaan. Lazarus raised a question, how do we rebut the argument that the mere existence of the threat of intervention from nuclear weapon states can prevent further escalation of conflict? Is there an instrument that can replace the position of nuclear weapons in such an argument? So Lazarus ingin bertanya, apakah karena adanya intervensi dari negara bersenjata nuklir, maka kita bisa menghindarkan eskalasi konflik? Atau adakah instrumen lain yang bisa menggantikan senjata nuklir untuk mencegah eskalasi konflik semacam itu? Is it clear enough? Pak Doni bisa memberikan respon lebih dahulu, and then Tim, would you also like to respond? I will give a chance to Doni Putranto first to respond.
Terima kasih Pak Muhadi atas kesempatannya. Ini dijawab dengan bahasa Inggris langsung atau bahasa Indonesia?
Ya, bahasa Inggris bisa.
Okay, so thanks to Lazarus for I think it's very interesting question. How can we actually rebut the argument that basically how can we replace this argument that whether or not there is an alternative from this deterrent effect? I think what also the ICRC and the overall International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement has been focusing on is on the humanitarian diplomacy, because at the end of the day, when we speak with various military officers around the world, we have never heard that they aim for an armed conflict or they aim for an actual conflict on the ground, because at the end of the day, they would like to see first and last the diplomats who do the conflicts, quote unquote. So I think from this perspective, we can actually build on something, especially when the TPNW enters into force eventually, that we can build on the diplomacy, especially humanitarian diplomacy, to replace the argument that only nuclear weapon states that can prevent conflicts. Because as we have seen actually in many contexts, diplomacy do work, and even without the intervention or intervention in literal sense of powerful states, diplomacy can prevent conflicts, and they can end conflicts without the necessity of having nuclear weapons in the picture. So I think that's pretty much what I can respond to Lazarus' question, Pak Muhadi.
Okay, thank you, Doni. Tim?
Yeah, I think that when a nuclear armed state is involved in a conflict or a dispute, the fact that it possesses nuclear weapons really contributes to greater tensions. I think that it doesn't in any way encourage greater restrained, and it certainly increases the risk of catastrophic consequences as a result of the conflict or the dispute. So I see the existence of these weapons is very much a destabilising factor rather than something that contributes to greater stability. And so I think that the weapons should be replaced not with any other instrument as such, but with greater dialogue and international cooperation.
Okay, I would give the next chance to raise a question to Siska Prativi. Siska, you can turn your microphone on.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Siska, and thank you for the opportunity. I want to ask to Tim because I am already asked it to Pak Muhadi last week about how is it hard for Indonesia to ratify the treaty. For Tim, that as we aware that the treaty needs 6 more parties, and I am really curious about your perspective about maybe for some countries without any nuclear weapons, how is it hard for some countries to ratify the treaty? Why they need take time to ratify the ratify the treaty about nuclear weapons? Because we also know, everyone know about the impact of the nuclear weapon itself, and of course, I also hope Indonesia can support the treaty as soon as possible. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very good question, because, of course, 122 countries voted to adopt this treaty, but not all of those countries have signed and ratified it yet. So it begs the question, why? Partly it's a bureaucratic problem in that countries have very lengthy processes that they need to go through with ratifications to ensure that the whole of the government is aware of the obligations under the treaty, to ensure that there's broad support in the parliaments and so on, and that the domestic laws that a country has in place are adequate to implement their obligations under the treaty. I think also it's a political question. Some countries want to see how other countries will act. They don't necessarily want to be seen as leaders on this, especially if they're concerned that they might be criticised by nuclear armed states for being too active in their support for the treaty. So it's easier to join a treaty that's been joined by many countries than to be one of the first to join it. For some countries that are allies of nuclear armed countries, there are implications for their alliances. So I'm from Australia, and the big issue in Australia is the military cooperation with the United States, and the fact that Australia is currently assisting the United States in intelligence gathering that could be used for the purpose of nuclear targeting. There's a big intelligence facility in Central Australia called Pine Gap, and Australia, if it were to ratify this treaty, which I hope it will in the future, would need to ensure that it in no way assisted the United States to use or possess nuclear weapons. And with other allies of the US, such as members of NATO, there's a lot of pressure on them by the US, but also by the UK and France to stay together in their opposition to this treaty, and certainly if one of those countries were to join the treaty by other members of NATO. So I think that they're afraid of taking a principled position on this issue because of the criticism that they might get. But over time, as more and more countries join, the criticism of not joining, I hope, will be greater than any criticism that they might face for joining the treaty. And of course, it's important simply to act out of principle and to act on the basis of the humanitarian imperative, as the Indonesian government put it.
Thank you, Siska. Thank you, Tim. Siska has been joining our campaigns during this commemoration of the 75 years of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So thank you very much, Siska, for active participation in this activity series. Okay, the next question will be from Andreta Arifin.
Good afternoon. First of all, I'd like to thank the committee and the speakers for the insightful session. I would like to ask two questions. I'm a layperson when it comes to military stuff, so I don't really understand if there's like a safe way to destroy or dispose of the weapons, since we're planning on abolishing the weapons completely, right? So that's my first question. Is there already a safe way to destroy or dispose of the weapons? How does it work? And second of all, I'd also like to ask, a lot of states may already agree that nuclear weapons are lethal, but those are mostly states that don't have these weapons. So I'd just like to know what's the progress been in convincing states that actually have these weapons, but still keep them on getting rid of these weapons completely. Thank you.
Okay. Tim first, and then I'll give also Doni Putranto to give a response as well.
Sorry, was that me first? So in terms of the dismantlement of nuclear weapons, this has already happened. Many thousands of nuclear weapons have been dismantled. At the height of the Cold War, there were around 70,000 nuclear weapons, and today there are 13,000. So quite a significant reduction. The first step is to remove the weapons from deployment. So weapons are either deployed on submarines or missile silos or on aircraft. So to remove them from deployment, and then to remove the warhead from the delivery vehicle. So remove the warhead from the missile, for example, or from the bomb. And then within the warhead is highly enriched uranium or plutonium, the kind of what's called the core, and that can be removed from the warhead, and they say that it's disfigured in order to render it unusable in a future nuclear weapon. So they're the basic steps involved in dismantling a nuclear weapon. It certainly can be done and has been done. On the question of how do we actually convince countries to dismantle all of their nuclear weapons, I think it will be a combination of international pressure. So being able to see that the vast majority of the world's countries want them to disarm and are very serious about that. And that pressure can be built through more and more countries ratifying the nuclear weapon ban treaty. And also domestic pressure. So using this treaty and the international adherence to the treaty as a way of generating debates within nuclear-armed countries about the unacceptability of nuclear weapons. I think also that this treaty can help through encouraging divestment. So billions of dollars are spent every year on modernising and manufacturing nuclear weapons, and many companies are involved in this work, many of the major arms companies. And these arms companies receive loans and other investments by a huge number of financial institutions around the world. So if we can convince those financial institutions to stop investing in these companies, that will have a significant impact on the global nuclear weapons enterprise. And I think all of these factors can contribute to disarmament over the long term. And the treaty is a really essential basis for that action.
Yes, thank you very much, Tim. The case of the non-participation of the nuclear weapon states, probably this can also happen in relation to international humanitarian law. Is there any case with the international humanitarian law in which countries do not become party in the IHL, Pak Doni, and how ICRC deal with these countries?
Thank you, Pak Muhadi. I think firstly, I think to respond to the previous question, I pretty much agree with what Tim has said. Especially, I would like to emphasize the importance of the pressure from the domestic level. That's why I think what the IIS-UGM has done in the past 3-4 years are really, really essential to raise the awareness of the public to understand what the treaty is and how nuclear weapons can impact the humanity in the long term. And this is also the focus of a survey that the ICRC did last year, in which one of the questions that we posed to around 16,000 millennials in 16 countries, including in Indonesia, whether or not they know about what nuclear weapons are and their impacts, and also whether or not they are aware of the existence of a nuclear ban treaty. It is quite interesting for us to see, and I think some of you has also read the survey and also see the survey. Essentially, the majority of the surveyed or the respondents confirmed that they do not want to have nuclear weapons being used in the world. However, also a majority of them, they are not aware of the nuclear ban treaty. So it is very important, not only in those 16 countries, but also around the world, and using all the technologies that we have. It is important to raise the issue to the policymakers and also to make it relevant to the country where those people are, and also to, as a consequence, then it would be very important for countries to eventually act on what the people say, because essentially this is a shared concern. It's not only a concern of the Gajah Mada University or the ICRC or the ICANN, but it is a concern of everyone's who are living in those countries in the world, basically. And then to respond to your question, Pak Muhadi, how the ICRC usually deals with parties to the conflict who are not party or who haven't ratified an IHL treaty. We usually also use the approach of non-legal elements. So, for instance, we also raise the importance or the relevance of religious and traditional or cultural values, especially for non-state armed actors, whereas they may not be, or they usually will say that we are not the state, we are not the government, and we will not we will not abide by those treaties or those laws because you are basically the government who is our opponent who ratified or who joined the treaty. And in that kind of circumstances, we then invoke where relevant religious, traditional, or cultural values. Because at the end of the day, I believe a large majority of people around the world, they value traditional principles, cultural principles, and also religious beliefs or religious values in some parts of the world. And this is also an aspect that may be relevant to be discussed or to be invoked when we discuss nuclear weapons abolition. And in addition, we also, we have learned that invoking only legal matters or legal elements when we speak to parties to the conflict who are not a part of a treaty or an instrument, it would be necessary to also bring in moral judgment or moral values into the question or into the discussion. Because otherwise, then we would be stuck in an endless cycle of legal discourses, which would not end or would not solve all problems, Pak Muhadi.
Hey, thank you very much, Tim. Thank you very much, Mas Doni. Tim, I have a question. You know that during the voting at the UN General Assembly, 122 countries supported the adoption of the TPNW. And then we have more than 80 countries signed the TPNW, and we had less than 50 so far. Could you tell us the profiles of the country who has ratified to see maybe the urgency that they had in ratifying this TPNW? And maybe this can be a lesson learned for Indonesia.
It's quite a diverse group of countries that have ratified. Most of I guess the regions of the world that have been fastest to ratify include Latin America, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. In ASEAN, we have every country except Singapore has signed, and 3 of the countries have ratified. And in fact, one of the very first countries to ratify was Thailand. Thailand was very actively engaged in the negotiations, and members of the Thai government said that this is something that they needed to get done very quickly to show that they're leaders on this issue. Also, Vietnam and Laos have ratified, and we're expecting ratification soon from Cambodia and Malaysia. But what are the factors? I think that certainly where we've had local partners who have been able to raise it very consistently and persistently, rather, with members of the Foreign Ministry, that has helped to move it forward. Also, having discussions with members of Parliament has often helped to move it along, and engagement. If we've been able to engage at the highest level of government, that has also helped. So in a few cases, we've been able to speak directly to the President or Prime Minister or Foreign Minister and really impress upon that individual the importance of getting the ratification done as quickly as possible, because each ratification kind of contributes to greater momentum, and we can see a bit of momentum now as we approach 50 with a lot of the recent ratifications kind of coming in more quickly than some of the previous ones. And governments are very interested in what other countries around them are doing, and so the fact that other ASEAN members have ratified should be should offer encouragement to Indonesia, I would hope. The region that we've had the most difficulty with would be the Middle East. We've just got one ratification so far from Palestine, and Europe has also been a problem area, and that's largely due to the fact that NATO has adopted a position against the treaty and isn't allowing its individual members to join up, even if they might be inclined to support it. I hope that will change in the future. But we do have a number of countries from Europe that have joined, including Austria, Ireland very recently, the Holy See, which is the Vatican, and San Marino as well. But I hope that answers your question to some extent, Mahadi.
Okay, we have a question from Nadia. Nadia has been involved in the campaign back to 2016. Okay, Nadia, would you like to turn on the microphone?
Okay, thank you, Pak Mohari, for the opportunity. Good afternoon, everyone. So during this global pandemic event that we are facing right now, I would like to ask whether or not there are any development in this issue. I mean, is it possible for us or like civil society or international community to convince the governments in many countries to allocate their budgets more on health services rather than armed purchases? I mean, that's our main concern right now in every part of the world. And I would like to ask also whether it's effective to convince the government through that approach, to humanitarian approach, to health approach or whatsoever. I mean, I think that this issue is more likely to a high political one compared to, say, climate change issue that everyone or even in grassroots community have concern or aware about it. I think not much of people knowing the importance to non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. So I would like to know from your insights. Thank you.
Okay, now Mas Doni first would like to respond.
Thank you, Pak Mohadi. I think for the question, I can't say much on behalf of the ICRC because at the end of the day, it is indeed the state's discretion on how to allocate their state budget. But it is true that the fact says that the majority of the states around the world, they still prioritize one element to another. And even for Indonesia, it's also the same. Nevertheless, I would like again to point out that it is indeed important for this particular issue of nuclear weapons to be discussed, to be debated, to be talked about, not only at the policymakers level, but if I may say, on every level that that it may be possible. For instance, in classes, in amongst your friends, amongst your family, and everything. Because at the end of the day, what we would need is the awareness of the majority of the people on the relevance of this issue and how to bring this issue to the attention of the government that it is indeed a priority for the people, not for a group of people in the society, but for everyone. I think that's pretty much I can say about this, Pak Muhadi.
Any comment from you, Tim? Any response?
Yeah, I think this is a very important question. Thank you, Nadia, for asking it. Yeah, what are the lessons that we can draw from the pandemic that are relevant to the nuclear weapons threat? I think one is that we need to listen to the warnings of experts, and there are experts who have been ignoring the warnings of a potential, or rather decision makers that have been ignoring the warnings of experts about a potential pandemic for many years, and now we have experts who are warning about the potential for nuclear weapons being used with catastrophic effects. And we need to heed the warnings of those experts. We need to act to prevent this, because we can't address the impacts of a nuclear weapon detonation. And the only way that we can ensure that the weapons are never used again is by eliminating them completely. So I hope that that is a lesson that is drawn from this experience with the pandemic. One of the, I mean, you could say that this could lead to greater cooperation among governments in the sense that they realise that the welfare of one nation's people is inextricably linked to the welfare of other nations. But it has also, of course, led to heightened tensions, including greater tensions among nuclear-armed states, with some of the blame games about, particularly directed at China, where the virus originated. But the other issue is that many governments are so focused on addressing the pandemic, and rightly so, that it's very difficult to get their attention for other threats such as nuclear weapons. But I hope that in the longer term we can think about how the international community can work together to invest in the welfare of humanity and to really reconsider the concept of security and what that means, and how security is really about having access to healthcare, having access to education and housing and so on. And nuclear weapons certainly don't make anyone more secure.
Okay, thank you very much. Lazarus has one more question to follow up the explanation from Tim with regard to the adoption of TPNW without the involvement of the nuclear weapon states. Although Tim explained that we can proceed with or without nuclear weapon states with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, but Lazarus raised a question how effective it would be without the involvement of the nuclear weapon states in implementation of the TPNW.
Yeah, so as you said, Mahadi, the treaty can certainly enter into force without the participation of any of the nuclear-armed states. Unlike some other treaties, such as the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which does require particular states to join it in order to enter into force. We were very clear with this treaty that no such requirement should be included in the text of the treaty. I think that the effectiveness of the treaty will only be fully realised over time. I mean, this is the case with any treaty. We're not going to see immediate results upon entry into force. We'll only see results after many years as more and more countries come on board. And I think that there will come a day when one or more of the nuclear-armed states becomes a party to the treaty. I think in the shorter term, our objective would be to change the position of some of the countries like Australia and members of NATO that don't possess nuclear weapons, but which are allied to nuclear-armed states. And if we can bring those countries on board, it will really show the strength of this treaty in affecting the behaviour of nuclear-armed nations. And we've seen with other treaties, such as the Mine Ban Treaty, which was negotiated in 1997, that even if some of the users and producers of the weapons aren't willing to sign and ratify the treaty, it can still force them to change their policies and practices with respect to the treaties, with respect to the weapons, rather. And that was the case with the United States, which hasn't ratified the Mine Ban Treaty, but which has brought itself largely into line with the prohibitions under that treaty. So I hope that we'll see nuclear-armed states taking action to bring themselves into compliance with the Nuclear Weapon Ban Treaty, even if they're not willing to become parties to it in the short to medium term.
Can I pass on to Mas Doni? Is there any case which similar to this situation in which the implementation of the IHL has been hindered by the fact that some or one powerful country or countries has not been part of it? Has there been any lack of effectiveness in the implementation of IHL in this case?
Okay, thank you, Pak Muhadi. It's a very interesting and very relevant question for IHL as well, because if I may mention a couple of IHL instruments that are relevant to this particular question, there are two at least. The first one is on the Convention on Cluster Munitions, and then the second one is the Arms Trade Treaty. Both conventions were adopted. The first one was adopted in more than 20 years ago, and then the last one was adopted only 7 years ago in 2013. And the Convention on Cluster Munitions basically prohibits states parties to use or to have a stockpile of cluster munitions. However, some powerful countries or major countries in the world, they haven't ratified or even signed the convention. However, this does not really hinder the implementation of the convention, where especially for those countries that have ratified the Convention on Cluster Munitions. Essentially, they eventually found another alternative to the cluster munitions. At the end of the day, it is a matter of willingness to find an alternative, because for those countries who have ratified the Convention on Cluster Munitions, they legally have to abide by what the convention says, because also every 5 years there is a review of state parties, review of convention, in terms of to what extent the countries have implemented the convention domestically and what kind of measures they have carried out domestically to not use again the cluster munitions. And some countries that we know, they eventually have found those alternatives to the cluster munitions. And secondly, for the Arms Trade Treaty, this indeed also an issue at the beginning of the treaty when it was adopted 7 years ago, because this treaty specifically deals with or regulates the trade of conventional arms between states. And it is indeed a difficult journey or difficult task that this treaty has, because for those countries who have tendencies or who is assessed to be likely involved in a human rights violation or IHL violation, then according to this treaty, they should not be allowed to trade arms, which is very difficult because, as we all know, priorities on security and defense affairs are particularly high for many countries. And this kind of questions also raises issues when this treaty was adopted and signed by many countries. although morally speaking, many countries really support or they are very supportive of this treaty. Nevertheless, for implementation, it is indeed a big challenge, not only for international organizations that are involved in those works, especially the UN, because they have a unit specifically to deal with disarmament, but also for state parties, because at the end of the day, there are also interests within the countries to assess how the implementation should work for this treaty. And it involves not only one ministry, but also a couple of even several ministries or state agencies in the country. And they have to be unequivocal, all of them, not only one, but all the relevant ministry to say that, okay, we will abide by this treaty. And it is still a challenge, Pak Muhadi, to implement some of IHL treaties, because although the core of IHL is not controversial, however, there are also branches of issues within the framework of IHL that may be considered as not in line with the state's priorities. I think that's, Pak Muhadi, that I can respond to your question.
Okay, Tim, comparing the anti-nuclear weapon movement from 1960s, 1970s, 1980s to today's, we knew that in the 1960s, 70s, or 80s, there were so many people went to the street to protest against nuclear weapons, but still it was not so effective. And now it seems that we are getting closer to our destination to eliminate nuclear weapon by abolishing nuclear weapon. Because we need only 6 countries to ratify, and then it will enter into force. Could you tell us, what do you think the difference between the anti-nuclear weapon movement in the past and today? What makes today's movement more effective than before?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to assess the effectiveness of the movement in the past. I think in many ways it was effective in the sense that nuclear weapons weren't used during the Cold War. They haven't been used in war at all since 1945, and that can be attributed in part, at least, to the fact that there has been such a strong movement against and that leaders would be certainly conscious of the very strong negative reaction that there would be from the public if nuclear weapons were used again today. And I think that that resistance in the 70s and 80s would have led to a lot of the reductions in the number of nuclear weapons around the world, and probably prevented more countries from acquiring nuclear weapons. In the 1960s, when the Non-Proliferation Treaty was being negotiated, a lot of the experts at the time were predicting that eventually 20 or 30 countries might develop nuclear weapons. Of course, that hasn't happened. The number of countries with the weapons has remained quite low. And so I think that these are all ways in which the anti-nuclear movement across the decades has been successful. And this contribution that we've made as ICANN and the movement of recent years with the Nuclear Weapon Ban Treaty has been a really important continuation of those decades of activism against nuclear weapons. We do still have people protesting against nuclear weapons in the nuclear-armed nations and in countries that host nuclear weapons in their territory. Just a few weeks ago, there were big protests at a number of the sites in the Netherlands, Germany, Italy, and Belgium, where nuclear weapons are hosted. There have been quite a few big protests at nuclear weapon facilities in the US and in the UK and France. Whenever nuclear weapons are transported on British public roads, there are huge protests to draw attention to that. So I think that that kind of activist movement very much continues, and that this treaty from 2017 is a tool that we can all use to build the momentum to zero nuclear weapons. And I think that we still, unfortunately, do have a long road ahead to zero nuclear weapons. But I hope that, or I'm confident that this treaty will help us get there quicker than would otherwise be the case.
Good. Any more question, response, or comment from the audience? Otherwise, this one. Okay, there is one question from Lulu Atika. She asks, can a state withdrawing from the NPT, is there any state already did this? Is there will be some state to follow up? And is it possible that we could get email from the speakers today? Oh, okay. Yes. Tim, there's a question about the NPT, the possibility of state party withdraw from the NPT. Is there any case already, and would there be any follow-up from the case?
Yes, it's possible under the NPT and indeed under the TPNW, the Nuclear Weapon Ban Treaty, for a state to withdraw. However, only in particular circumstances. With the NPT, there is the example of withdrawal, only one example of a state withdrawing, being North Korea, or the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. I think that was 2003, and it subsequently developed and tested nuclear weapons on a number of occasions. Some countries have argued that that withdrawal was unlawful, that it didn't meet the requirements set out in the NPT, whereas North Korea argues that it did meet those requirements, and that it couldn't be expected to comply with the treaty, given that the 5 nuclear weapon states under the treaty weren't meeting their disarmament obligations. That's it's unfortunate that happened, and I think that demonstrates the limitations of a non-proliferation approach, where you're just trying to stop the spread of the weapons instead of saying that the weapons are unacceptable for all countries. And so the Nuclear Weapon Ban Treaty establishes the same standard for every state. It doesn't create different categories where different obligations apply to different countries.
Lulu also asked a question if she can get the email contact from the speakers. Would you mind if I share your email to her? Tim? Tony?
Yes. Sure, yes.
Yes, it's there already. Okay, I have one question about strategy. You know, although ICANN and ICRC has been partner for this issue, but at the IIS, it is for the very first time we work very closely in this 75th anniversary of the atomic bombing. I came across a quite interesting thing when we would like to post in Twitter, Instagram, or in other media, social media, we mention the name of the US as the country who dropped the bomb. And the ICRC said, oh, we are not supposed to mention any name. So we have two different or even contradictory strategy here in the sense that for ICRC, it is very important not to mention any names specifically, but for us at ICANN, it is important to name it. To name, look for example, the study conducted by Pax Christie with the title "Don't Bang on the Bomb." It contained a list of companies with invested on the nuclear weapon. Can I ask you, what is the argument for not mentioning any name in the case of ICRC, and what is the argument for naming in the case of ICANN?
Okay. So should I go? Okay, thank you, Pak Muhadi. Yes, I think what different here is only the approach of how we deal with this issue. It's not only for nuclear weapons issues or in this regard, but also for all issues where the ICRC works, because it relates to our modalities and our modus operandi to be impartial and to be neutral, and not to focus on the suspects in a way, if I may use the term, because this has been the modalities and modus operandi of the ICRC since our establishment. And also, it also relates to the fundamental principles of the international Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. And one of them is neutrality, and then other is impartiality, independence, and others. And what matters here is actually that we have the same goal, and however, indeed, we have a different approach. And in other cases, we also face the same situation. Nevertheless, we can still work together to promote and to raise the awareness, the importance of the TPNW, and also the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, that everyone, at least they should be aware of this issue. So it's a matter of approach and the modus operandi that we are bound to not really focus on a certain set of things, however, to focus on another set of things. And it also reflects, this also reflects on the figures that I showed in the last slide, if I'm not mistaken, on the Nagasaki and Hiroshima, to only show the numbers of humanitarian consequences, the numbers of people who were affected and others, and not to show the actors behind it. Although it is indeed important, nevertheless, it is not within the ICRC's modus operandi to focus on that, Pak Muhadi.
Okay, Tim?
Yeah, thank you, Mahadi. That's an interesting question. It's something that we try to do consistently, is to ensure that the United States is referenced whenever we talk about the atomic bombings, mainly as for educational reasons. A lot of people don't know that basic fact. And of course, the weapons didn't simply fall from the sky, they were dropped, and this was no kind of accident or natural disaster. It was a very deliberate atrocity committed by the United States, and we think it's important to highlight that. There's still a dominant narrative in the United States and in many other Western countries that the bombings were justified, that they saved many American lives by killing many thousands of Japanese. And so we by talking very frankly and honestly about who committed these atrocities. We think that's an important way to try to change the narrative and challenge some of the myths that have been propagated by the US government with respect to what happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Well, thank you very much for your answers, Tim and Mas Doni. Any more questions from the audience? Okay. Well, one more question for Mas Doni from ICRC. Dia would you like to raise your question yourself? Okay, the question to Doni is about ICRC. Saat ini Perhimpunan Nasional, yakni Palang Merah Indonesia, telah memberikan IHL pada anggota muda dan masyarakat. Namun, modul IHL ini masih sangat terbatas dan anggota PMR pun masih banyak yang tidak sadar pentingnya IHL. Bagaimana tanggapan Mas Doni dan apakah ada cara lebih efektif agar masyarakat dan pihak dapat lebih sadar tentang hal ini? There is a question for ICRC, for Doni, about the training given by training of IHL given by ICRC. Is there any way that ICRC can conduct different ways to make it more effective? Mas Doni?
Ya, terima kasih Pak Muhadi. Terima kasih pada Mbak Dia juga atas pertanyaannya. Jadi memang untuk hal ini butuh proses dan butuh waktu. ICRC bekerja sama dengan PMI ataupun PMI sendiri sudah cukup lama memang menyebarluaskan hukum humaniter di Indonesia. PMI sendiri pun melalui jaringan mereka yang sangat luas di berbagai belahan Indonesia di sini juga cukup aktif untuk menyebarluaskan hukum humaniter, baik itu di tingkat KSR, relawan, ataupun di tingkat PMR di sekolah. Namun tentu ada situasi di mana mungkin penyebarluasan di sini perlu ada penyesuaian pendekatan karena prioritas. Misalkan sekarang saat pandemi, misalkan mungkin fokusnya dialihkan ke pandemi dibandingkan ke penyebarluasan hukum humaniter secara spesifik. Dan untuk pertanyaan modul, memang hal ini terkait dengan ketersediaan fasilitator di setiap daerah, di setiap tingkatan di mana PMI berada misalkan. Karena ICRC hanya ada di Jakarta dan jumlah kami terbatas secara sumber daya manusia, jadi tidak dapat menjangkau seluruh elemen masyarakat. Dan itu pula kami pun sudah membuat bersama dengan PMI juga semacam modul kecil, buku pengantar bagi fasilitator untuk mereka dapat menyebarluaskan hukum humaniter atau hukum kemanusiaan kepada kalangan masyarakat secara lebih luas. Dan terakhir, kami pun juga bekerja sama erat dengan dunia akademik, seperti contohnya dengan IIS-UGM ataupun Fakultas Hukum dan dari universitas-universitas yang lain untuk menyebarluaskan hukum humaniter yang harapannya para mahasiswa, dosen, dan lain sebagainya mereka mengetahui hukum humaniter yang nanti kemudian akan disebarluaskan lebih jauh kepada masyarakat luas. Lalu juga ICRC juga semakin aktif menggunakan teknologi media sosial contohnya untuk dapat lebih dekat dan lebih menyebarluaskan hukum humaniter secara lebih sederhana namun dan tetap memiliki pemahaman yang kurang lebih sama. Demikian Pak Muhadi.
Baik. Okay, thank you very much for the audience. One more question for ICRC. How ICRC looked the issue after Lebanon was blown up?
Okay.
Johnny, do you have any
Yes.
comment?
Thanks. It's very interesting. Well, JCRC is responding to the situation in Beirut specifically because we have a delegation or an office in Beirut, and working with the Lebanese Red Cross, we especially provide medical assistance to the medical facilities and personnel on the ground, as well as we are working with the Lebanese Red Cross in linking families who are separated because of the explosion. So we have established a specific website and hotline for those who are seeking their family members' whereabouts in Beirut. This is called Restoring Family Link, which is a backbone of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movements activities, not only in such situation in Beirut, but also in armed conflict as well as in disasters.
Okay. Well, I think we are close to the end of our session. I would like to thank you for the presentation to Tim and Mas Doni, and also thanks to the audience for the active participation. The organizer would like to ask you now to turn your video on because we would like to take picture together. Could you please turn your video on for a little while only? Mbak Intan, could you tell us when you will take a picture and when it finished?
Oke. Sebentar, Bapak. Satu, dua, tiga. Sekali lagi, boleh ganti pose. Satu, dua, tiga. Oke, terima kasih.
Okay, thank you very much for the great discussion that we had today. Thank you once again, Tim, right, for your time and the opportunity that you give to us, as well as to Mas Doni. Thank you very much for your time, as well as for the good cooperation. And we look forward for further cooperation with ICRC. And Tim, we need, again, your support for the campaign in Indonesia to ratify the TPNW. Okay, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Pak Muhadi.
Speakers. Thank you once again. Have a nice evening.
Thank you, Pak. Thank you, Tim. See ya.